This is the 5-minute guide to the USS Niagara, a slightly odd ship of the United States Navy.
There have been quite a number of ships named USS Niagara that have served in the United States Navy. However, this video is going to focus on perhaps the oddest one of the bunch, the third ship to bear the name. The first USS Niagara had been a brig that had served on Lake Erie in the War of 1812. The second was a heavily armed steam frigate launched in 1855 and that would later see service in the American Civil War, being decommissioned towards the end of that conflict. The third USS Niagara would actually start life as a regular civilian steamer, built by John Roach and Sons in Chester, Pennsylvania, just over a decade after its predecessor had left service. But, as we said, at the time it was simply the Niagara, a civilian vessel. The more interesting part of the ship's story begins in the lead-up to the Spanish-American War. There was rising unrest in Cuba in the 1890s, and a lot of American businesses supported the insurgents. This being the Gilded Age, they saw an opportunity to profit from a war that was practically on their doorstep. Spain, which owned Cuba at the time, was understandably not that happy with the American government doing virtually nothing to stop these businesses smuggling arms to the insurgents. But outside of the business interests, there were a number of other powerful groups and individuals in the US who really wanted the US to go to war with Spain and kick them out of Cuba, for a whole variety of reasons, some more honourable than others. One such person was William Randolph Hearst. Now remember that name for later. When the battleship USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbour, Hearst would lead a media campaign that blamed the Spanish, which in part helped push America into a war with Spain, although as it turned out, the Maine probably exploded due to internal causes. In a propaganda stint for the war effort, a group of wealthy businessmen in New York got together and funded a ship for the US Navy for the war. This was quite useful since, at the time, a relatively isolationist series of congresses had left the US Navy in a position in which the majority of the fleet was geared around coastal defence, not oceanic campaigns, and moreover was scattered all over the place, not concentrated in the areas where Spanish holdings were near US territory. The ship that they would purchase would then become the USS Niagara, which they turned into a water distilling and supply ship. The idea being, ostensibly, that since America would be fighting on an island, they would likely need fresh water for the troops. Albeit, one does have to wonder what they thought all the Cubans who already lived on the island had been drinking on a day-to-day basis for the past few hundred years, but never mind. She would displace just over 5,000 tons, was over 275 feet long, 38 foot wide, and had a just over 19-foot draft. With her steam power plant, she could make a relatively pedestrian 12 knots. As she was due to serve in a war, she was duly armed, with 2 6-pounder guns, 4 3-pounder guns, 2 37mm guns, and 1 Colt machine gun. Light artillery being something that you could buy as a civilian in 1900s America. The crew of 57 was complemented by 12 Marines. Now, remember William Randolph Hearst? He and his friends were the primary backers of this particular ship, and ended up giving the US Navy something that was somewhat closer to a luxury yacht than a supply ship. The officers ate from porcelain china with actual silver flatware, and you might not think, well, that's not too unusual. But this wasn't all. There was enough of this high-end crockery to supply the entire crew, right down to the lowliest sailor. And all of her small arms, rifles, pistols, holsters and belts were all embossed with Niagara in expensive engraving. Ironically, the ship's rifles, whilst being made by Remington, used 7mm Spanish bullets, which I bet the Spanish were regretting. The ship would be commissioned into the US Navy on the 11th of April 1898, under the command of Commander George A. Bicknell. Niagara's active career in the US Navy was only 6 months long. Departing New York on the 25th of April, stopping at Norfolk, Virginia and Key West, Florida on her way to Cuba, she would then sail to Puerto Rico and Haiti. She returned to Hampton Roads, Virginia on the 26th of May, and departed again on the 30th, staying in the Caribbean for a bit longer, heading back to Cuba and then Puerto Rico again. She would leave Guantanamo Bay in Cuba on the 24th of July, arriving back in New York on the 3rd of September 1898. The ship was something of an oddball for the United States Navy, being that it was funded by private individuals and given to the Navy, who hadn't been looking for it and weren't really especially sure what to do with it. With the war over, the ship really didn't have any place in the Navy, who had, somewhat unsurprisingly, long ago solved the problem of fresh water supply on warships without needing entire mobile distilling plants following them around. So it was decommissioned on the 14th of October 1898 and sold on the 19th of July 1899. There is some suggestion that the ship may have gone on to serve with the Gulf and Southern Steamship Company as the SS Brunswick between 1912 and 1918. In either case, when the ship was decommissioned, a man by the name of Francis Bannerman, who was a major military surplus dealer, bought up all that fancy equipment we mentioned that had been bought for the ship, and would continue to sell off bits and pieces of it until 1927.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to tag your question with Q&A if you want to leave a question for the dry dock.